Hello, my name is Lillian,
I'm Sankha.
I'm Lutheria.
and today we will be talking about visual feature learning without labels. So, in the world today, we are inundated with data, and specifically with image data. To gain some understanding about how much data we have, the number of 32 by 32 color images in the world is on the order of around 10 to the 7,000. That is thousands of orders of magnitude more than the number of images seen by all of humanity. We in our AR networks could actually learn so much from them. But the problem is that only a very small amount of it is labeled for supervised learning. Some large datasets exist, like ImageNet, Coco, Pascal, Voc, etc., but getting human annotations for these is extremely expensive and inefficient. So, how do we use these vast resources to our advantage without having to spend billions of dollars to get people to label it? One way to do this would be with unsupervised learning or inferring patterns from the data. Unsupervised learning methods include clustering and reconstructing. These methods have been studied extensively, but without the success of supervised learning. Another somewhat more novel idea is to do self supervised learning, which tries to bridge that performance gap by incorporating supervised learning techniques without human annotated labels. In order to get a network to perform some target task, like object detection or segmentation, we introduce an auxiliary task that we train the network on. With this auxiliary task, we can do supervised learning using labels that are inherent to the data that don't require manual annotation. Once the network is pre-trained on this auxiliary task, the hope is that the network has learned something analogous to the target task, can be easily fine-tuned for said target task without the need for a huge annotated dataset. In exploring methods for feature learning without labels, we take a look at the following three papers.
Let us look at the first paper, Unsupervised Visual Representation Learning by Context Prediction. So this work explores the idea of using spatial context as a source of free and supervised signal for training a rich visual representation of images. The idea is to extract random pairs of patches from the image and then training a convolutional neural network to predict the position of the second patch relative to the first. The idea is if we can predict the position of the second patch relative to the first, we can have an idea of the context in the image. Uh, the problem this solves is, as we said before, there's a lot of images available without labels. So, without any supervised way, if we can get the context of an image, we can learn a lot of labels automatically. If we take a look at the first example, we can see a bus. As a human, it's easy to understand because by looking at the bus signboard and the second patch shows the wheel, we can figure out that it's a bus, and the second patch belongs somewhere at the bottom right side of the first image. Similarly, for the second example, we can figure out by looking at both the patches that it's a train, and the second patch is uh, top center placed compared to the first one. But can we train a neural network to do the same? This is what the problem is trying to solve. The paper also gives a very good example by placing it in a nicer context. It takes the picture of a cat, splits it into two uh, sections. One has the face and one has the left ear. And then it shows that the left ear is placed at the cell number 1 and the center is placed at cell number 5. So, if you put it in a more mathematical sense, the idea is to take a representation from this and mapping it into a larger image where the x is this is first patch, and given an input, can we map the location of the second patch relative to the first. So in this case, we can see if the right ear is given, which is cell number 3, the network should predict the output of 3. Let us take a look at the architecture. They use a standard convolutional neural network layered with max pooling layers and local response normalization layer stacked on top of another, and at the end they use fully connected layers. They have a paired network, and at the end they merge it with a fully connected layer. Each of these items in the pair is actually a standard AlexNet layer. AlexNet layers are a standard network definition that is used in the neural networks literature and has been referred in the paper. The idea is that each of these AlexNets reason about the image independently, and then they are merged together at the end in the fully connected layer. So the idea is the bulk of the reasoning of the network is done independently, and at the end, the inputs from each of the independent AlexNet layers are merged, and then at the end, the FC9 layer outputs a softmaxed output of the probability of where each of the second patch might lie in each of the 8 spatial configurations as shown in this diagram. Now that we looked at the architecture, one thing to note is that we need to avoid trivial solutions. The way trivial solutions can occur is if we have two patches that are adjacent to each other, and instead of learning the higher level features, the network can just learn the boundary conditions and how the textures are merging into one another and just replay that. So, the way we tackle that is introducing gaps between the patches. As we can see in this cat picture, the the gaps between, let's say, patch 1 and 2 is different from gaps between 4 and the center patch. So by varying the gaps and adding jitter to the patch locations, we are ensuring that the network focuses on the higher level features rather than the how the patches gradually change into another if they are at the boundary of each other. Even after doing that, it is not enough. The problem was traced to an unexpected culprit, chromatic aberration. The way it is because of the way the lenses in cameras capture light at different wavelengths. In some cameras, one color channel, mostly green, is shrunk towards the image center relative to the others. So, when the convolutional neural network looks at it, it can learn where the camera lens focused, and then once it knows the absolute location of the focus point of the camera, it can learn the relative positions of each of the patches. Very it's really easy to learn the relative position of the patches once you know where the camera focused. So the way it is done, the way the authors suggest to look at this is they try to shift the green and magenta axis of the colors towards the gray projection, or they randomly drop 2 out of 3 color channels and just replace those color channels with random Gaussian noise, where the standard deviation is 1/1000 of the standard deviation of the remaining channel. And this seemed to work pretty well for their experiments. The exact mathematical way with which they shift the green and magenta uh, projections is discussed in detail in the paper. Let us take a look at the results. So here we have 4 images that are used as the query image to the network. Now if we have a random initialized network, we can see that the network predicts some random images from the ImageNet dataset as images that are similar to the input image. For example, the bike's wheels have been predicted to a dog's mouth, and horse's legs have been predicted to some random lines, and so on. Now, if we have, for comparison, they also train an ImageNet uh, dataset on the AlexNet, and the AlexNet performs quite well, but still there are a little bit of problems as apparent from the last example. For example, if we have a cat's face as the input, we can see that the AlexNet predicts the cat's body as well as other things as similar to the cat. Whereas if we have ImageNet trained on unsupervised network as shown in this paper, we can see that the predictions are very close to the original one, and this is what we want. So this performs very well on finding the nearest neighbors. And we'll take a quick look at the applications of the network shown here. The first one is nearest neighbors, which we just discussed in the last slide. The second one is learning of chromatic aberration. We just discussed how to fix the chromatic aberration, but the authors also decided to see if they can learn where the chromatic aberration is present from the XY coordinates of the patches sampled from ImageNet. It performed surprisingly well on 10% of the images, and the average root mean square error was 0.255, which was pretty good. Next up, we have object detection. So it's a well-known thing that previous work on the Pascal VOC challenge has shown that pre-training on ImageNet dataset and then using them for fine-tuning the network and using it for object detection using Pascal training dataset has shown a significant boost because of the ImageNet dataset's pre-training. But these people used uh, the unsupervised learning framework that they developed for pre-training and used the same dataset as Pascal VOC challenged and showed that a similar performance boost can be achieved, as shown in this table. As we have here, they show that uh, their network versus the ImageNet pre-trained network shows a very similar performance boost, even though it's a bit less than the ImageNet trained network, but it's still significant compared to the rest of the other methods. Similarly, even if the VGG architecture is used, there's a significant boost in the performance as well, as can be seen from these numbers. Something that they noticed from this work was that the network was very sensitive to objects even though it was not trained to find them. So they try to use this for geometry estimation, and it performed as well as a standard network that has been trained using the ImageNet model. But the self-supervised learning also detects geometries as good as a standard ImageNet AlexNet network. And the last application that they talk about is visual data mining. The task at hand is to find out clusters of images that have the similar objects or look the same. And the problem here is, even though the nearest neighbors task that they showed works pretty well for this, but the problem is it does not work as well for textures. So what they do to solve this problem is they actually find a constellation of four adjacent patches from an image, and then they find a matching spatial arrangement, and then they use a kind of geometric verification task that they developed previously and try to cluster the images together. And as we can see from the right image, the images are aligned very well from the results.
The second paper explores a new innovative and supervised way to create visual representations of images using CNNs. The key idea of this work is to leverage unlabeled videos harvested from the web to provide implicitly the supervision. In order to do so, the authors utilized visual tracking to extract pairs of patches that should have similar visual representations in deep feature space. This completely unsupervised approach was found to yield highly competitive performance on the object detection and the surface normal estimation tasks when compared to the corresponding supervised approach of training CNNs, during which labels of images are available. However, this is not the first time that unsupervised techniques attempted to learn visual representations. Previous work were mostly based on static images or frames extracted from videos that provided implicitly the supervision. Contrary to those approaches, following works claimed that static images might not convey enough information for a good visual representation to be learned. Their intuition lied in the fact that humans learn those representations from years of dynamic sensory inputs. But again, this is not the first time that video information was used to learn feature representations. So what differentiates the current work from the previous ones is that the authors incorporated the idea that two frames of the same video should have similar representations into a deep metric learning scheme. Specifically, the goal of deep metric learning is to learn a metric function from training data to calculate similarity or distance between samples. Although this approach has been used before to learn visual representations, all of the previous work utilized labeled data, whereas the current one is completely unsupervised. Given that this approach doesn't leverage labeled image data, its first step is the extraction of frames of interest from the web unlabeled videos that could be used as training instances. The ultimate goal of this procedure is to get different views of the same object by tracking. For that reason, the authors followed a two-step procedure that enabled them to detect patches with motion. They first obtained surf interest points, and following they used improved tense trajectories to obtain motion of each surf point. Finally, the best bounding box was found as the one containing the most of the moving surf points and was used to perform tracking. Two different object views, the query and the tracked, were extracted from each patch of video frames and were used as training instances of the same object in the configuration we will describe next. So after creating the pairs of training instances, the problem is formulated as follows. Train a neural network such as the two visual representations that correspond to the same training paths will be mapped close together in the learned feature space. However, in order to avoid the possibility that all points are mapped to a single point in the feature space, an additional constraint should be used. For that reason, the authors proposed the sample of a random patch that served as a negative example. So finally, the ranking loss function for training is equivalent to minimizing the Euclidean distance between the two representations of the same track, while at the same time maximizing the distance between the tracking and the negative patch. As far as the neural architecture is concerned, a Siamese triplet network was used to learn the feature space. This network consists of three AlexNet-based networks that share the same weights and parameters, while each of them used only two fully connected layers. The feature representations for each input instance are extracted from the last layer by forward propagation. At the experimental part of the paper, the authors conducted both qualitative analysis of their model and they also reported results on downstream vision tasks. So firstly, they demonstrated that the feature representations learned in the previous section could indeed capture semantic information of images. Therefore, they used VOC 2012 validation set as the set of queries, and for each query they retrieved the top k neighbors from a random AlexNet and AlexNet trained in a supervised way using ImageNet, and finally their unsupervised approach. The results clearly showed that the proposed model learned good visual representations when compared to a random parameter CNN, while at the same time the results are surprisingly competitive to the ImageNet CNN, which is already learned on semantics. As far as the quantitative experiments are concerned, the model was evaluated on two challenging tasks. For the object detection task, the RCNN pipeline was adopted, which borrowed the CNNs pre-trained on other datasets and fine-tuned on it with the VOC 2012 dataset. Afterwards, SVMs were trained on top of the extracted features for each object class. The authors reported performance result on the object detection task with and without fine-tuning on the VOC. Furthermore, they are compared with the model trained from scratch without utilizing pre-trained data, as well as with the model that uses ImageNet pre-trained CNNs. The results indicate that the proposed unsupervised network provides a significant boost as compared to the scratched network, while at the same time the performance comes close to its supervised counterpart. The same behavior was noticed when model was evaluated on the surface normal estimation task. So finally, given those surprisingly good results, the authors claimed that semantic supervision should not be considered a strong requirement for training CNNs.
In our final paper, the authors take the methods from the previous two papers and combine them in a similarity graph to better understand the inter- and intra-instance invariances of the objects. The idea is that each instance has inter-instance invariance or visual similarities with other instances of the same type of object, like the two cars A and B seen at roughly the same angle, as well as intra-instance invariance or similarities within one instance at different viewpoints, like the two viewpoints of car A, shown as A and A prime. These invariances are already explored and exploited in the previous two papers. Using the transitivity of invariance, they can then just say that, for example, A and B prime are similar and B and A prime are similar. With these similarities enforced in their network, they are able to better cluster images and do object detection on benchmark datasets. They construct the similarity graphs in the following way. First, image patches are extracted from videos, as explained from the second paper, and a node is created for each image patch. These nodes are then clustered by first finding their features learned from the first paper's methods, and then finding their cosine similarity. The nodes are clustered in a two-stage fashion. First, they apply k-means clustering on the nodes, where k equals 5,000, and drop the clusters with fewer than 100 instances. The remaining clusters are the parent clusters. Then, within each parent cluster, each sample finds its top 10 nearest neighbors. For each group of 4 nodes that all rank each other within their top 10 nearest neighbors, they are clustered into so-called child clusters, and they are all connected with an inter-instance invariance edge. Then, these patches, which were originally taken from videos, are tracked across 30 frames. The images at the beginning and end of the clip are added to the graph, and these are connected with an intra-instance invariance edge. With these edges in place, they can now assume transitivity of invariance. Thus, they expect all nodes with any path connecting them to be similar in their high-level representation. With this graph made, they can now train the network for the auxiliary task, which is finding the distance between nodes in the graph. They once again use a triplet Siamese network, where each of the 3 towers uses the VGG16 structure for the convolutional layers, and they use a ranking loss function. The input to the network is a triplet sample of image patches, where the first 2 are a positive pair, meaning that they're similar according to the invariance graph, and the last forms a negative pair with the previous patches, meaning they are dissimilar according to the invariance graph. More specifically, the third is from an entirely different parent cluster than the first 2. In the first example shown in the figure, 2 patches of the same instance at different viewpoints are shown, while in the second example shown in the figure, 2 patches with a so-called transitive invariance, or different instances at different viewpoints but still with semantic similarity, are shown. With these kinds of examples, and with the constraint that the distance between related samples should be smaller than the distance between unrelated samples, the network should learn a better representation of the image patches. We now move on to their experiments and results. First, in order to create similarity graph, they downloaded 100,000 videos from YouTube and tracked around 10 million image patches to pre-train their network on the self-supervised learning tasks as described in the previous 2 papers. Then, they constructed their graph as explained and used their results for many different target tasks. The first target task was simply a qualitative look at what their similarity metric gave. They looked at the Pascal-Vogt 2007 dataset and did a nearest neighbor search on certain images. First, they tested just the self-supervision method described in the first paper. Then they used the combined pre-training with the transitive invariance described in this paper. And finally, they compared their results with a strongly supervised network pre-trained on ImageNet, another large-scale object detection dataset. We can see that there is more variety to the angles of objects in the same category in the results of their proposed network, which is both what is expected when applying the idea of transitive invariance to the images, as well as helpful in getting the network to understand what it is looking at. This difference is especially visible when considering the results from the self-supervision of the first paper, which all look to be from a uniform viewpoint. They also looked at the receptive fields of the highest activated nodes in the last convolutional layer and found that it mostly lights up at truly semantic parts of the objects, like eyes or wheels. They then moved on to object detection. Using a fast RCNN as the backbone architecture and testing on the Pascal-Vogt 2007 dataset, they are able to get comparable results by pre-training on the proposed self-supervision task as when doing strongly supervised pre-training on ImageNet, with only a few percentage points difference. The self-supervision also outperformed all other tested methods of object detection. In addition, they found that tracking for a longer period of time and doing clustering from features learned from the first paper boosted performance as well. They also tried using a faster RCNN, which, unlike fast RCNN, is a full end-to-end object detection network. Again, they have comparable results on Pascal-Vogt 2007 to pre-training on ImageNet, as well as on Microsoft Cocoa, which is a much more difficult image recognition dataset. Finally, they dabble in surface normal estimation, and they found that they actually improve performance on the NYU V2 dataset in comparison to pre-training on ImageNet. Ultimately, we conclude that unsupervised or self-supervised methods still cannot outperform fully supervised learning, but it can give almost as good results at a much lower cost. These 3 papers brought some very novel ideas to the table. When we think about it in hindsight, the patch reconstruction idea from the first paper is a relatively simple one, since we know that in order to figure out how to reconstruct an object from sampled patches, we have to have a good high-level understanding of what it should look like, and for that, we have to know what it is. But the authors were quite innovative in order to come up with this idea in the first place for a self-supervised learning paradigm. They were also really able to dig deep into a part of how humans do recognition. We don't recognize things from static images. We are able to consolidate our other 4 senses to interact with objects, touch them, experiment with them, and ultimately use all this information to recognize these objects in images. Similarly, the authors realized that for a network to do the same, they should bring together many different methods of image understanding to build on each other. The most important thing to improve performance, it seems, is to combine multiple unsupervised or self-supervised methods and use them in conjunction to make gains at a higher, more abstract level of understanding. Although supervised learning is still best, these papers advance the search for non-labeled methods and pave the way for a more generalized method for learning without annotations in the future. And here are our references. Thanks for listening.